A very good morning to everyone. So today I'll be doing the Hindu analysis of 22nd of November. I have shared the screen with you. Okay, so I've got this editorial on the screen. It says alarming countdown. All nations must strive for net zero carbon emissions. So the title of United Nations, the title of United Nations latest report, Broken Record, is a clever pun. Now, what is this report talking about? Not only does it suggest that the previous warnings of the consequences of rising greenhouse gas emissions are being ignored, but also that new ceilings are being breached. So, your new report of United Nations and this UN report which comprises of broken records, this says that it suggests that the previous warnings of consequences of rising greenhouse gas emissions are being ignored. So under this report, they have said that GHG's warnings have been ignored. And the new ceilings have been breached. So GHG warnings have been ignored and new ceilings regarding GHG, that means you need to counter your use of articles that are going to lead to more of greenhouse gas emissions. That new ceilings have also been ignored, or you can say it has been breached. Now, the annual emission reports, usually timed close to the beginning of the climate talks, reiterates in sharper language that progress. Now, since the Paris Agreement of 2015 has been tardy, the stated goal was to keep the temperature from rising over 2 degrees centigrade and as far as possible below 1.5 degrees centigrade of pre-industrial levels. That means when we were having this Paris Agreement, under this Paris Agreement, it is said that the limit that was kept was 2 degrees centigrade and to the max, that means as far as possible. That means it was 2 degrees centigrade and if possible, it was at 1.5 degrees centigrade. Now this 1.5 degrees centigrade is of pre-industrial levels. Fine. In the last few years, much of the consensus has been that we should be directing all our efforts towards keeping it below 1.5 degrees centigrade. That means the temperature of the earth has been rising constantly very high. So what was said that keep the temperature or the rise of the temperature, that is the rise of the temperature should be below 1.5 degrees Celsius. That means this should be the limit. Now the broken record report, however, suggests that accounting for all commitments made by the countries as per the Paris Agreement to minimize their economy's reliance on fossil fuel. That means what they are saying is that the commitments of the Paris Agreement or commitment of the countries under Paris Agreement. What is it suggesting? It is suggesting that the economies should minimize their reliance on fossil fuels. One recommendation is coming is minimizing the reliance on fossil fuels. Temperature should be result in an overshoot of 2.5 degrees centigrade to 2.9 degrees centigrade by the end of the century. To keep temperature below 2 degrees centigrade, emissions by 2030 must be cut 28%, and for 1.5 degrees centigrade, they need to be shaved by 42%. So the numbers are saying that if you need to do what? If you need to bring the temperature that is below 2.5, 2 degrees centigrade, I mean, if you want the temperature to be below 2.5 degrees centigrade, the emissions need to be cut down by 28%, and the time period will be by 2030. That means right now we are in 2023. So if you want the temperature rise to be less than 2.5 degrees centigrade, what you need to do is you need to cut down the emission by 28%. And if you want that the temperature rise should be less than 1.5 degrees centigrade, that means if the number you are targeting is less than 1.5 degrees centigrade, less than or equal to 1.5 degrees centigrade, then the emissions need to be shaved by 42%. Again, the time period is 2030. So if you are, thinking about this. Now, despite many countries have promised to be net zero, meaning no net carbon emissions, the report does not think these promises are credible, and even in the most optimistic scenarios, the likelihood of keeping emissions below 1.5 degrees centigrade are 14%. That means countries have been, talking about this, and what they have found is that even though they are targeting this 1.5 degrees centigrade, but what is found is that the reports doesn't have the credibility, and the reason being that if you are keeping the emissions below, if you're keeping the emissions very less, that means targeting 1.5 degrees centigrade, your emissions are only cut by 14%. That means target is this, but actually, what need to be done is that the emission need to be cut down by 42%. But what is actually happening is that the emission is cut down only by 14%. So if you see, there is contradiction in this. Okay, why? Because countries are not doing what they have committed. Fine. Okay. However, it is not as if the Paris Agreement has been infructuous. Greenhouse gas emissions in 2013, based on policies in place, were projected to increase by 16% at the time of adoption of the Paris Agreement. While the projection is increased by 3%, to keep temperatures below 1.5 degrees centigrade, annual emissions must reduce every year until 2030. That means if you want, or if you are targeting reduction of the temperature by 1.5 degrees centigrade, what is expected is that you need to cut down emission every year. What the report says is that the world collectively emitted 57 billion tons in 2022, an increase of 1.2% over 2021. The pandemic saw 4.7% drop in emissions, but the projection for 2023 suggests that the globe is nearly back to pre-pandemic emission levels. Now, what is being said is, see, this was the time when, just a minute. Now, this was the time of pre-pandemic. Then you have the time of pandemic, and then you have the time of post-pandemic. Now, what is the author suggesting? The author is saying that the period of today, that means the post-pandemic period, the emissions or the condition of GHGs or the temperature is similar to the condition of pre-pandemic level. That means during pandemic, we witnessed what? Cut down in emission. But pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, the period is witnessing what? Similar emission and similar GHG contributions. Now, the consequences of the globe's tardiness are writ large. As of October this year, 86 days were recorded with temperature over 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. September was the hottest record month ever, with global average temperature of 1.8 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. Now, in terms of solutions, the report repeats sage advice that has been offered for years. Now, the richest countries and those historically responsible for gobbling sparse at atmospheric capacity for carbon must commit to greater and faster reduction. While legalists and nitpicking have been the characteristic of climate summit, precious little time is remaining for the world to get this act together. So what you need to do is, or what is the editorial suggesting, all in all is that you need to do what? You need to cut down the emissions. Because time is less, we need to cut down the emissions. So as we could check the rise in temperature. So this editorial was talking about, that means you need to cut down your carbon emissions so that all nations must strive for net zero carbon emissions. Fine. Now let's move on to the next editorial. Okay, recognizing the impact of climate change on health. Now, as India gets ready for the 28th Conference of Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, it is important to examine how climate change affects the country's health. Now, India's inadequate health systems make our population particularly vulnerable to the impact of climate risk on health. Climate change affects health directly, causing more sickness and death. In more direct ways, it affects nutrition, reduces working hours, increases climate-induced stress. Now, the author who are writing about this, one is the CEO of Health System Transformation Platform. That means the person is one of a guider on the health basis. Now, another one is a senior advisor of health systems in the same company. So, again, the person is operating in the health system. So, what they are doing is that they are trying to bring health along with the climate change. Now, the precipitating factors continue to be unrelenting. One estimate suggests that if global temperature were to rise by 2 degrees centigrade, many of parts of India would become uninhabitable. That means if the temperature rises by 2 degrees centigrade, the authors are of the opinion, or the writer is of the opinion, that many places in India would become uninhabitable. Now, all nations during Paris Agreement agreed to cap the rise in the temperature by 1.5 degrees centigrade. Clearly, they have failed. The year 2023 saw the highest temperatures and heat waves in the recorded history. The situation is likely to worsen for the planet. Climate emergencies, that is extreme heat, cyclone, floods, etc., are expected to occur with increasing regularity. So the authors, writers are saying that we have failed. We have failed in what aspect? Because we have thought about what, or we have talked about in Paris Agreement that the rise of temperature at 1.5 degrees centigrade should be capped. That means in Paris Agreement we are talking about capping and capping what? The rise of temperature by 1.5 degrees centigrade Celsius. Now, when we are talking about capping the temperature rise by 1.5 degrees Celsius, what is happening is that we need to check our carbon emissions. But what we have found is that 2023, this year, the present year, has witnessed what? Has witnessed highest temperature and heat waves. Highest temperature and heat waves. That means we have clearly outpassed or surpassed this thing that we have committed to. And this highest temperature and heat waves are ultimately going to lead to what? This will lead to intense floods, cyclones that the country is going to witness in future. Fine. Now these will interfere with what? Food security and livelihood and sharpen the health challenge. So because of this, that means high temperature, there will be what? Floods, cyclones, etc. And because of this, what is the writers are saying? They are saying that this will affect your food security because a lot of people will get displaced. So displacement will happen. There will be a lot of destruction also. So food security will get affected, and at the same time, It will challenge the livelihoods. It will also bring in health issues. Right? And all this is because of rise in temperature. And the rise in temperature is going to lead to this situation. And this will ultimately challenge this. Fine. Okay. Now the double burden. Now what is the double burden talking about? It says that the double burden of morbidity that India faces from communicable and non-communicable diseases will be worsened by climate change. Now, it could facilitate the growth of vectors such as mosquitoes, sandflies, ticks, and yes, yet another unknown ones, and change the seasonality of infection through changes in their life cycle. It could also facilitate the introduction of vectors, pathogens in areas where they did not exist before, such as mosquitoes in the Himalayan states. Now, one thing that they are talking about, this is again very important, and then they are saying what? That there will indeed be a double burden. And this double burden will be regarding what? There will be introduction of pathogens. And these pathogens are what? Or flies, mosquitoes, etc. In the areas where they never existed, like in the Himalayan regions. Now, heat also alters the virulence of pathogens. Reduced availability of food and water and the decrease in the nutritional value of food increases vulnerability to disease. That means it is, this is known to everyone. So this is not a new phenomena. If their nutritional capacity of the humans are hampered, nutritional capacity is hampered, what is going to happen is that they are being or they are going to be vulnerable to disease. And this shall increase with less of nutritional capacity and more vulnerability to disease. Now, epidemics commonly occur after floods, but extended warm period also promotes the proliferation of water and foodborne pathogens and diseases. Now, less well organized is the impact of the climate change on non-communicable diseases and mental health, both of which are poorly managed in India. Heat, physical exertion, and dehydration are a constant state for laborers, could lead to kidney injuries, which are rising in India due to uncontrolled diabetes. So, again, the writers are saying that how is your climate affecting the situation? For example, if there is, there's, climate is getting immensely affected, this will firstly lead to what? Firstly, this will affect or this will lead to communicable and non-communicable diseases. Now, communicable diseases and non-communicable diseases. Communicable diseases, I just talked about, these are coming from pathogens. Non-communicable diseases, they are talking about mental health. And another thing they are saying is that, okay, now, non-communicable diseases and mental health. And both of these, that means non-communicable and mental health, both are being very poorly handled in India. Now, when they are poorly handled in India, what is being the cause behind it, or what will happen in future? They say that because of high, a lot of extreme heat, exertion, you can say rise in temperature. All this is leading to what? All this will lead to diseases. Now, what are those diseases? They say dehydration in laborers. The first thing they have pointed out is dehydration in laborers. Now, because of this dehydration in laborers, the laborers are going to now face what? Kidney issues, which is again very prevalent in India. And prevalence of kidney issues in India is primarily because high diabetic patients. Now, chronic obstructive pulmonary diseases are exacerbated by increased and extended episodes of air pollution. So the risk of dying from pulmonary diseases increases by 1.8% to 8.2% during a heat wave, and hospitalization rates will go up by 8% for every 1% increase in temperature above 29 degrees centigrade. Okay, so they are primarily of the opinion that as there is rise 1% rise in temperature, what you will witness is that the hospitalization rate goes up by 8%. Depression aggravated by stress generated by change in weather condition. Post-traumatic stress disorder, that is your PTSD, invariably accompany a climate emergency. So the authors are again of the opinion that depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, all this is going to lead to what? Or all this is rising because of climate emergency. Now, these are rarely recognized in India and much less addressed. Now, India is urbanizing at rapid pace in an unplanned manner. Urban areas not tempered by urban greenery and open spaces and filled with asphalt roads and heat retaining buildings that physically block air circulation and bear the worst ill effects of climate change due to urban heatland effect. Now, this urban heatland effect is the concept of geography. And what is your urban heatland? Now, urban heatland is a concept. What is this concept talking about? That means urban areas are warmer than surrounding rural areas, especially at night. Means under urban heatland effect, one condition that exists is the urban areas are heated much higher as compared to or they remain warm as compared to the surrounding rural areas. Now, climate change puts further pressure on the weak urban primary health systems already suffering the ill effects of air pollution, urban planning that discourages physical activity, and work related cultural stress. Now, mitigation efforts begin with understanding the direct and indirect pathways by which climate change impacts health and assessing the burden. Now, currently, the health information systems are not modified to gather this data since the impact is accentuated by socio-economic conditions. Having systems in place for social support and health services will reduce the impact. But the benefit from upstream interventions that focus on better urban planning, green recovery, water conservation, and public health interventions will be much larger, not only for health but for many determinants of health. The writers are of the opinion that we are having these urban heatland effect. Now, urban areas, the temperature is rising. Now, when urban areas temperature is rising, how could these kind of issues be controlled? So they are saying that what you need to do or what need to be done is a better urban planning. Now, this better urban planning can be done how? Now, this better urban planning can be done by increasing the green cover, bringing in water conservation, and also bringing in what public health interventions, which will be in the form of what not only for health but for the determinants of health. That means improving or working on the determinants of health. Fine. Further moving, what are the writers are of the opinion? Now, action to control climate change needs to happen at global, regional, and local level. Pathways of climate change and their impact will determine the appropriate area of interventions. To achieve this, India has to recognize what climate change and its impact on health as a problem that can be addressed and need to be addressed. Researchers who work in this area need to come up with a policy option for action. Now, national, state, and local governments have to decide to act on policy options that have been generated by research. Only when the three streams of problematization, policy options, and political decision making come together in meaningful change will happen. Now, the author is saying that what needs to be done is, and we need to make better policies. Now, policies require what? In policies require a lot of research that need to be done. Now, when you do research, what is going to happen? You are going to, get onto the areas where the problems are occurring. Now, because of the issues that you will able to find, decision making will become easier. Now, it will be worthwhile to examine if these necessary conditions have been satisfied before expecting a change in status quo on climate change and its impact on health. Further moving on to the another article. climate finance. Now, what's climate finance? A new report that was published by OECD showed that economically developed countries fell short of their promise to jointly mobilize $100 billion a year towards climate mitigation and adaptation needs of developing countries in 2021. 1 year past the 2020 deadline. That means, just a minute. Fine. Firstly, the thing is, what is climate finance? That means all the finance that is going to come, or all the contributions that are made in order to what bring an impact on climate. And how is this going to happen, or how this is talked about? So it is said in the report of OECD that what the developed countries have jointly promised for what? To mobilize $100 billion for what? Climate mitigation and adaptation. Now, and they have failed. Who? The developed countries. Why? Because they were not able to mobilize this much of amount, so as to this amount could be worked or could be used to work towards climate mitigation and adaptation. Now, this shall lead to what? This shall bring or would help the developing countries to adapt such ways, or to meet all the challenges that aroused with respect to the climate. So they were not able to meet this goal. Now, why is the reason this OECD report becomes important? So the OECD report is largely a group of rich, developed countries, including US, UK, Germany, France, Switzerland, Canada, and others. Now, the report as such offers a peek into their idea of climate finance ahead of Conference of Parties 28 climate talks in the UAE next week. Now, where the topic is expected to be a key or bone of contention. Now, the report also comes against the backdrop of a pledge by the bloc of developed nations at the COP26 talks in Glasgow in 2020 to double adaptation finance. That means it was the developed countries who themselves came forward, where or when. So it was during COP26. Now, during the Conference of Parties 26, this conference was held back in 2020 in Glasgow. And there, what did they talk about? Now, they talked about to double the adaptation finance. Now, parties to United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, that is UNFCCC, has also said at Glasgow with deep regrets that a developed nation bloc hadn't met this $100 billion climate finance goal in due times. Now, the failure to mobilize climate finance lowers the capacity in developing countries to address the climate mitigation, like emission reductions with renewable energy. Now, see, what is going to happen is, if this goal of $100 billion is or would have been achieved, or you can say if this is not achieved, so what is the counter effects of this? What is going to happen that this target was set by the developed countries, and the developing countries are leading to what? The developing countries are not able to reduce their emissions. When they are not able to reduce their emissions from where? From renewable energy. That means, sorry, non-renewable energies. Now, what they want to say is that if you want to reduce the emissions, if you want to reduce the emission, what you need to do is you need to shift towards renewable energy. Now, if the country is going to shift towards the renewable energy, they require infrastructure for that. Now, infrastructure for developing countries in one go is not possible. So, what is going to happen is the finance that they have talked about, that means the developed countries had talked about the climate finance to accumulate. Now, this finance will be taken help, and this shall lead to what? Reduction of emissions through renewable energy. That means by using renewable energies in the developing countries. Now, if you are going to bring in renewable energies, what is going to happen? Other than this, now they said that first use renewable energies, and second they said that you should adapt what? Climate resilient agriculture. And reduces trust among the world's poorer countries that the developed world is serious about tackling the climate crisis. That means, see, what is happening is this was the goal that was kept in Conference of Parties 26, and that happened in Glasgow. Now, it was the goal that was kept by the developed countries to have finance of $100 billion that would be assembled by the developed countries. Now, if you fail to achieve that, what is going to happen is that at the world arena there was a message sent, and what is that message sent? That the developed countries are not taking this goal seriously. And which goal? That is to mitigate the climate, to mitigate all the climate changes. Now, how is climate finance accounted for? Now, the OECD report showed that $73 billion mobilized in 2021 by the public sector via bilateral and multilateral channels. That means the first is $73 billion, and this shall be coming by public sector. And this is public sector. It could be through bilateral or multilateral channels. The next thing they said, $49 billion, and they say this shall be provided by loans. While the report does not classify them in terms of the rates at which they are provided, that means rate. I mean, if you are giving the loan, it means you will be getting the interest also. So the rates have not been provided. Data available elsewhere sheds light on the extent to which the rich countries rely on loans at commercial rates to fulfill their climate finance obligations. Now, what does this mean? For example, an assessment by the American non-profit research group Climate Policy Initiative of Global Climate Finance Flows between 2011 and 2020 found that 61% of climate finance was provided as loans, of which only 12% was at concessional interest rate. That means 61% of the money or 61% of the climate finance. That means the loans, the money that has been accumulated in the climate finance. Just a minute, okay. See, the money amount that has been accumulated out of climate finance. Now, this amount is say there was there was a huge amount. Now, yeah, under this amount, only 12%, as they say, was given, or the loans were given with concessional interest rate. That means there was a concession that was given. That means supposedly the loan was given on 5% interest rate. So some kind of concession will be given in, and when the concessions are given, then probably that 5% could have been 2%. I like, we all don't know, but with concessional rates, it's just an example. Right now, so when the OECD report states that a two-thirds of public climate financing was provided as loans, it means the condition attached to such financing could further exacerbate the debt stress. That means loans will ultimately or can lead to debt stress. This is also a critique of the OECD report, as it considers was loan at face value, not the grant equivalent, when arriving at total climate finance figures. This means that while poorer countries shell out money towards repayment and interest, the loan is still counted as climate finance provided by the developed world. That means the author is saying that even we are going to give what? Interest. Who? The developing countries. But still, it will be said what? That it is the developed country that have contributed towards what? Climate finance. If if you are able to understand, you see, the developed countries is contributing towards climate finance, but the developing countries, if taking loan through climate finance, is actually paying the interest. Now, when they are paying the interest, so similar is the scenario. That means developing countries should also get the credit for that. But ultimately, the credit will be given to the developed countries for contributing towards climate finance. Now, what is additionality? Another issue in the OECD report pertains to additionality. What is additionality? The UNFCCC states that developed countries shall provide new and additional financial resources to meet the agreed full cost incurred by developing country parties in complying with their obligations under the convention. What does this mean? Now, this means that the developed countries cannot cut overseas development assistance in order to finance climate needs, because that would effectively rob Peter to pay Paul. What does this mean? That rob Peter to pay Paul. It says that what you if the developed countries see, what they're saying is the developed countries should provide what? New and additional financial resources to meet the agreed full cost incurred by the developing country parties in complying with their obligations under the convention. This means that developed countries cannot cut overseas development assistance in order to finance climate needs, because that would effectively rob Peter to pay Paul. In real world terms, it would mean cutting off support for healthcare to reallocate that money to, say, install solar panels. That means cutting the money of health to pay for solar panels. Now they say, see, what is happening is that the developed countries are doing what? The developed countries are providing overseas development assistance. Now, when they are providing overseas development assistance, they can't say that, or they shouldn't do it in a way that I have provided you what development assistance. Now, you should do what? You can meet the climate changes. That means you are just robbing the Peter to pay the Paul. That means you are not providing them, or you are cutting down the development assistance, and then you are providing the similar money, or you can say the similar finance for climate mitigation. The new and additional finance also means that the developed countries cannot double count. For example, a renewable energy project could contribute to both emission reduction and overall development in a region. However, as per United Nations Convention, donor countries cannot categorize such funding as both ODA and climate finance because it wouldn't fulfill the new and additional criteria. Yet they do. A few years ago, European Union officials have admitted to double counting development aid as its climate financing. Now, what they are saying is that, see, if you are, or if the developed countries, for example, are contributing towards a renewable energy project, when they are contributing towards renewable energy project, what is happening is you are leading to what? Development of a project. Now, this development of a project is happening how? By constructing or by building a renewable energy source. Now, when you are doing so, what are you doing is you are developing, correct? But at the same time, the developed countries are doing what? They are showing that we have also given, or we have contributed towards climate finance. Now, see what is happening. You have given, or you have contributed towards a development project, but you are counting it as climate finance also. That means you are double counting it. What? That means you gave finance for development of a renewable energy project, but now you are also saying that we have contributed to climate finance. And when the author is saying this, he has given the example of European Union, what they have done in past, saying that we have developed the resource, and at the same time they have counted it as a climate finance also. So this is what is additionality. Now, what counts as climate finance? At present, there is no commonly agreed definition of climate finance because developed countries have endeavored to keep it vague. So we are having no definition of climate finance. For example, at COP27, that is Conference of Parties 27 in Egypt, last year, Australia and UK even sought to end discussions to define climate finance. In COP26, the US led an effort to block debate on common definition. The lack of definitional clarity has reportedly led to ridiculous situations like funding of chocolate and gelato stores across Asia and coastal hotel expansion being tagged as climate finance. That means they have contributed towards the developing of gelato stores, and they have said that this also is what? Climate financing. The ambiguity works in favor of richer countries because it leaves the door open to arbitrarily classify any funding. including the overseas development assistance and high-cost loans as climate finance and escape the scrutiny that a clearer definition might bring. Therefore, while developed countries can claim they have provided billions in climate finance, the actual flow needs to be checked to know whether they went into climate mitigation and adaptation in developing countries or something else. Now, how much financial assistance do developing countries need? Now, OECD report claims, based on preliminary, that $100 billion goal was likely met in 2022, but the data is neither finalized nor published, and the advisable takeaway is skepticism. Now, the OECD report added that by 2025, developing countries are estimated to require around $1 trillion a year. Now, the $100 billion goals pales in comparison dwarf the further fact. Now, what role can private sector play? Again, very important, because we have talked about public sector, how and since private sector is emerging and they have huge capacity to bring out climate mitigation and adaptation. What is their contribution? To meet the scale of the challenge, people like US climate envoy John Kerry and World Bank president have routinely emphasized the role of the private sector. OECD report threw cold water on such hopes, showing that the private financing for climate action has stagnated for a decade, while public funding from multilateral channels, both multilateral development banks and multilateral climate funds, increased in the same way. As a course correction measure, the OECD report suggests that de-risking with government's intervention and called on MDBs to integrate with private finance mobilization. Reasoning is that private sector can help what? Enable climate action. And how? Because they have huge capital with them. See, this is what they're saying for investment in developing countries. But as of today, there aren't any signs that the private sector is interested in. The problem is particularly worse for climate adaptation because investment in this sector can't generate high returns. That means private sector always operates on profit basis. So what they find is that when they are going to invest in climate finances, they are not able to generate enough of profit or enough of output. So when they know that this market is not going to provide them with enough of finance or enough of profit, why would they even try to invest on it? So private sector seek and which the mitigation sector like solar or wind farm could generate. At the end of the day, the ball rocks back into the court of public funding, that is government in the developed world plus multilateral development banks. The OECD report shows that even those who place hope in higher private funding for climate action in future recognize that it is government and MDBs, that is your multilateral development banks, that are enabling parties here. What they want to say is, see, firstly they're saying that bring in private sector. Why? Because they have a huge potential of investment. But the point is that this private sector is going to bring in investment, fine. But why will they invest in a market which is not going to provide them big output? So ultimately, this private sector will talk about what? Getting themselves out from the market. Now, when they are not going to invest, then which is the one who is left? That is public funding. Public sector is going to fund along with the multilateral development banks. Now, these two are going to contribute towards climate financing. And if at some time you find that the private sector has invested in climate mitigation and adaptation, what you will see is even then, when you are find that private sector has investment, you will find that public and multilateral development banks are the one who have actually brought this sector. They haven't came, willingly. Okay, so I've covered 3 editorial, and these were very important with respect to your this editorial section. Other than that, what you can do is that you can go through this India-Japan coverage in Southeast Asia, because India and Japan, again, it becomes very important with multilateral relations. Then you have cloud seeding here. You can go, you can study about cloud seeding. This topic becomes very important for the people who are having philosophy optional, because of their importance on Indian materialism. Then okay, this becomes again important. What coal isn't easy to exclude from sustainable development. So just go through this. What is the contribution of these fossil fuels towards energy supply? And since we have done about climate financing and net carbon emission, then again this topic becomes very important with respect to climate change. Thank you so much.